Okay, in this week's lecture, we're going to look at mockups and prototypes. And we're going to speed through and just recap some of the stuff that we looked at last week. So just before we get started, I'm just going to recontextualize and talk about wireframes and how they relate to other things. I'm going to give you an overview of mockups. We're going to talk about the qualities of mockups. Then we're going to pivot to an overview of prototyping, qualities of a prototype, the types of prototyping that you can do. So just to kind of recap from the last time, but just so that you know, wireframes are two-dimensional representations of a screen interface. They're used to establish the best way to display and prioritize page content. Low-fidelity wireframes are used during the ideation and planning phase to explore potential solutions and layouts. High-fidelity wireframes are used during the development phase to finalize page structure before adding visual design elements. So that's the kind of the underpinning of the context. We're coming from thinking about wireframes to block out our screen. The next thing you do after you have created your wireframes, whether that's a like a low fidelity sketch by hand or a more formal digital one, is you move on to doing a mockup. A mockup is a static, high fidelity visualization of an app or a web design. All visual design is complete in the mockup. So it looks like the real thing. It's got all the color that you're going to use. It's reflective of the color palette that you're going to employ. It uses the typefaces that you've got in mind, all the iconography, images, all that kind of stuff. It looks like it's visually complete for all intents and purposes. It focuses on the visual details. And it's a representation of what your final website or your app will appear to the user. Okay? Usually, as well, if you are creating an app or a website design, you will do a mockup that shows a desktop portrait orientation, as well as a desktop landscape orientation, as well as a mobile portrait orientation. So some key differences, differentiators between mockups and wireframes is that, as you can see on the left, a wireframe shows the structure, the functions, and the content, right? On the right, you can see the same design, but showing a visual markup, which has a true representation of the styles, the colors, and the actual correct content that's going in. So that's the kind of key difference that's important to distinguish between the markup and the wireframe. Now, why do we do markups? Really to establish stylistic continuity between desktop and mobile interfaces. So when you're doing, as I've mentioned just now, when you're doing a mockup, you usually do a mockup of the, if you're doing a website, of the landscape version of what it looks like on a computer, and also a portrait version of what it'll look like on a smartphone or a smart device. Now, similarly, if you're doing an app design, you would generally an interface of what it looks like on a smartphone, but also what your app looks like on a tablet device. It's also used to establish stylistic continuity between pages. So not just between two separate interfaces, but from one screen to another screen, how does it look consistent, right? So this is what it's a really useful thing to do. And to help us catch and fix design errors early on. When you're working with clients, it's also a really good tool for communication to establish and fix the aesthetic of where the design is going. Now, one of the mistakes that sometimes new designers make is that they don't communicate enough about the aesthetic early on, and they start to develop something, and they spend a lot of hours developing something, and then they go back to show the client, and the client goes, oh, no, I don't want that. That's not what I want. And you've spent all this time, if it's a website, coding, the design and the functionality in. It's really good to do a visual markup early on just to get them to sign off on it and say, this is what it's going to look like. Are you happy with this? If not, let's iterate, let's revise the design to settle on something that you are happy with. It's also an opportunity to find new design ideas. Mockups make it easy to preview, test, and refine before moving forward. That's all part of that communication with clients and other stakeholders. Now, when do we do mockups? Usually, mockups should be created during the prototyping phase, so phase 3. It's usually done also after the wireframing process and before we move on to an interactive prototype. So there's obviously a whole range of tools that you can use to do your mockups. If you're comfortable using Photoshop, that's awesome. There are a whole range of tools that you can use for mocking up and then prototyping as well. That's a good idea to stay in a package that you can do your markup in and then do your prototyping in, because then you're not double handling stuff. But if you feel comfortable with, let's say, using Photoshop that has very limited interactivity, prototyping potential, you can still do that. And actually, XD is, because it's an Adobe product, it plays really nicely with Photoshop. So if you put your visual markup together in Photoshop with all of your layers, you can import that PSD file into Adobe XD and it retains all the layers, and then you can add interactivity to it, which is super cool. Okay, so let's talk about what a prototype is. It's basically a high-fidelity visualization of the product's design. So it's the next step on from creating a mockup. Where a visual mockup is kind of static, it's non-interactive, a prototype is where you actually start to put it together and make it interactive so that people can click on it and engage with it so it feels like the real thing. It's a fully interactive, rich experience that incorporates things like interactions and animations. It shows all of your intended UI in a way that's very functional and accurately simulated. But it's still not the final product. And this is important to distinguish. As UX designers, when you're working particularly in the app design space or creating digital products like apps, you're not going to have the skills to do all the hardcore programming to actually develop something in a fully interactive way. So a lot of the time you're developing prototypes, right, or interactive prototypes. Now, when you go out to work as a UX designer, there is no expectation for you to be able to code all that stuff on your own. If you're a front-end developer, that's a slightly different thing, but just in terms of app design, that's no expectation. All that kind of technical stuff gets handed off to a programming team to deal with that kind of stuff in the space of app design. So why do we prototype? So firstly, we prototype to try and work out, does this design solution meet the user's needs? We can actually test this with a prototype. You're going to develop a prototype, you're going to test it with people, get them to see if they find it user-friendly, if they find it logical to use, and if they don't, that's when you iterate and fix those things. It's also an opportunity to catch and fix visual issues and interactive bugs as well. And it's still an opportunity to find new design ideas. So when do we do prototyping? Now, there's actually two types of prototyping. There's low-fidelity prototyping, and then there's high-fidelity prototyping. Now, low-fidelity prototyping is a usability testing technique that's used to refine UI designs. And it's an exercise often completed at the start of the prototyping process. These are different to wireframes because they're supposed to include more realistic buttons, hyperlinks, and interactions. Now, back, I don't know, about 5 or 8 years ago, paper prototyping used to be much more important because it was a lot of effort to get a high-fidelity prototype up and running. And basically what people would do is they would do paper prototyping. So as you can see in the image there on the right, paper prototyping involves getting a sheet of paper, drawing, like you might draw the case of a phone or a tablet, and then you'd cut out, get a pair of scissors and you'd cut out a circle, or you'd cut out a rectangle to represent the screen, and then you'd get other paper, and then you would draw interface elements and kind of get all these paper bits together. And the way that you would prototype a low-fidelity paper prototype is you would sketch these things out and you would put all this paper on like this here, and then you would get your users to come and you'd sit next to them and say, okay, so this is the home screen, use the app. And then they would pretend to press a button and then you'd shuffle the paper around, you'd change the screen, and then you'd go, okay, now you're on the second screen. And then they would press the next thing and then you would do that. Now, 8 years ago when it was more of a hassle to put together a digital prototype, that was a very worthwhile technique. Now, it's so quick to put a digital prototype together, you don't even really, I would argue that in most cases, you don't need a lo-fi paper prototype. Now, high-fidelity prototyping refers to digital prototypes with refined visuals, content, and interactions, and this is often completed towards the end of the prototyping process. So how do you do your prototypes, your digital prototypes? There's a range of prototyping tools, including things like Origami Studio, Sketch, Ozio, Webflow, InVision. If you intend to work in the UX design industries, Sketch is a software that was used quite extensively, but it's finding less favor with people these days. I would argue that Figma and XD are the up-and-coming ones. Figma has an edge over XD in that it's completely online browser-based. So for collaboration, it's really fantastic. Adobe XD's strength is its integration with the Adobe Creative Cloud Suite. So if you're familiar with any of the Adobe products, the integration, shortcuts, things like that, a lot of that stuff will be familiar to you. And even better, if you use things like Photoshop, you can actually create your visual mockup in Photoshop, like I said, and bring your PSD Photoshop document file into XD and have all your layers there and do amazing stuff with it. Okay, like I said, this was a very brief lecture. I just wanted to cover some of these ideas and give you the distinctions between some of the terminology that we use. Wireframes are used to visualize interface layout, content, and other intended behaviors before progressing into the design process. Visual mockups are static, high-fidelity visualizations of the screen designs, i.e. non-interactive. Paper prototyping is a low-fidelity user testing technique used to visualize site layout, app screen design, whatever. High-fidelity prototyping using tools like that is a process of visualizing the final site layout or your app design, aesthetics, and user interactions. And it's actually fully interactive. Any questions about that?